Hello, spooky friends, and welcome to another episode of Pastatime with the Scariest Podcast.
Woo!
I'm Robin Grace, this is Adam Diaz,
Hello.
And today we're here to read you folks some creepypastas.
Indeed we are. Creepypastas are the short fictional stories. Well, they're not always short. We try and read the short ones that have been posted on the internet in different places like Creepypasta. Also, No Sleep Reddit. We go to the SCP Foundation sometimes, which in retrospect I kind of wish we would have done tonight. And then we also get some sent to us by the wonderful spooky friend community. Robin, if someone had a short fictional story they would like to send, or they would like to recommend a pre-existing short fictional story that exists currently, how could they talk to us?
You can email us at pastatime@scariest.com. You can also go to our website, which is scariest.com. There's a contact us page. You fill that out and it gets to us that way. You can also contact us on all our social media, so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and I think that's it.
Yeah, all the fun places. So I'm going to be going first. I'm going to be reading a relatively long one and then a short one tonight. So my first one is going to be called The Tulpa. Last year, I spent 6 months participating in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I found an ad in my local paper looking for imaginative people looking to make good money. And since it was the only ad that week that I was remotely qualified for, I gave them a call and we arranged an interview. They told me that all I would have to do is stay in a room, alone, with sensors attached to my head to read my brain activity. And while I was there, I would visualize a double of myself. They called it my Tulpa. It seemed easy enough, and I agreed to do it as soon as they told me how much I would be paid. And the next day, I began. They brought me to a simple room and gave me a bed, then attached sensors to my head and hooked them into a little black box on the table beside me. They talked me through the process of visualizing my double again and explained that if I got bored or restless, instead of moving around, I should visualize my double moving around or try to interact with him, and so on. The idea was to keep him with me the entire time I was in the room. I had trouble with it the first few days. It was more controlled than any sort of daydreaming I'd done before. I'd imagine my double for a few minutes, then grow distracted. But by the 4th day, I could manage to keep him, quote-unquote, present for the entire 6 hours. They told me I was doing very well. The second week, they gave me a different room with wall-mounted speakers. They told me they wanted to see if I could still keep the Tulpa with me in spite of distracting stimuli. The music was discordant, ugly, and unsettling, and it made the process a little more difficult, but I managed nonetheless. The next week, they played even more unsettling music, punctuated with shrieks, feedback loops, what sounded like an old-school modem dialing up, and guttural voices speaking some foreign language. I just laughed it off. I was a pro by then. At this point, if this is me, these are red flags. They're clearly summoning a demon with whatever I'm doing, and that's what that weird language is. After about a month, I started to get bored. To liven things up, I started interacting with my doppelganger. We'd have conversations or play rock, paper, scissors, or I'd imagine him juggling or breakdancing or whatever caught my fancy. I asked the researchers if my foolishness would adversely affect their study, but they encouraged me. So we played and communicated, and that was fun for a while. And then it got a little strange. I was telling him about my first date one day, and he corrected me. I'd said my date was wearing a yellow top, and he told me it was a green one. I thought about it for a second and realized he was right. It creeped me out, and after my shift that day, I talked to the researchers about it. You're using the thought form to access your subconscious, they explained. You know on some level that you were wrong, and you subconsciously corrected yourself. What had been creepy was suddenly cool. I was talking to my subconscious. It took some practice, but I found that I could question my Tulpa and access all sorts of memories. I could make it quote whole pages of books I'd read once, years before, or things I was taught and immediately forgot in high school. It was awesome. Can you imagine having a Tulpa with you when you're taking a test or something like that, where you can constantly just imagine yourself talking to it and it's giving you all the answers?
That'd be great.
That would be amazing. That was around the time I started, quote-unquote, calling up my double outside of the research center. Not often at first, but I was so used to imagining him by now that it almost seemed odd to not see him. So whenever I was bored, I'd visualize my double. Eventually, I started doing it almost all the time. It was amusing to take him along like an invisible friend. I imagined him when I was hanging out with friends or visiting my mom. I even brought him along on a date once. I didn't need to speak aloud to him, so I was able to carry out conversations with him, and no one was the wiser. I know that sounds strange, but it was fun. Not only was he a walking repository of everything I knew and everything I had forgotten, but he also seemed more in touch with me than I did at times. He had an uncanny grasp of the minutiae of body language that I didn't even realize I was picking up on. For example, I thought the date I brought him along on was going badly, but he pointed out how she was laughing a little too hard at my jokes and leaning towards me as I spoke, and a bunch of other subtle clues that I wasn't consciously picking up on. I listened, and let's say that date went very well. That's all it says, but, I mean, obviously, you know.
Bigfoot.
You gotta read it in that voice. That date went very well. By the time I'd been at the research center for 4 months, he was with me constantly. The researchers approached me one day after my shift and asked me if I'd stopped visualizing him. I denied it, and they seemed pleased. I silently asked my double if he knew what prompted that, but he shrugged it off. So did I. I withdrew a little from the world at that point. I was having trouble relating to people. It seemed to me that they were so confused and unsure of themselves while I had a manifestation of myself to confer with. It made socializing awkward. Nobody else seemed aware of the reasons behind their actions, why some things made them mad and others made them laugh. They didn't know what moved them, but I did, or at least I could ask myself and get an answer. A friend confronted me one evening. He pounded the door until I answered it and came in fuming and swearing up a storm. "You haven't answered when I called you in fucking weeks, you dick," he yelled. "What is your fucking problem?" I was about to apologize to him and probably would have offered to hit the bars with him that night, but my tulpa grew suddenly furious. "Hit him," it said. And before I knew what I was doing, I had. I heard his nose break. He fell to the floor and came up swinging, and we beat each other up and down my apartment. I was more furious than I had ever been, and I was not merciful. I knocked him to the ground and gave him 2 savage kicks to the ribs, and that was when he fled, hunched over and sobbing. The police were by a few minutes later, but I told them that he had been the instigator, and since he wasn't around to refute me, they let me off with a warning. I don't know about that. I'm just saying, like, yeah, if you say, like, self-defense, this is my place, and they ran away, they would be like, okay, we're going to investigate further. I don't think they just write down, like, don't fight no mo, and then, like, hand you a ticket and say, like, warning. My tulpa was grinning the entire time. We spent the night crowing about my victory and sneering over how badly I'd beaten my friend. It wasn't until the next morning when I was checking out my black eye and cut lip in the mirror that I remembered what had set me off. My double was the one who'd grown furious, not me. I'd been feeling guilty and a little ashamed, but he'd goaded me into a vicious fight with a concerned friend. He was present, of course, and knew my thoughts. "You don't need him anymore. You don't need anyone else," he told me, and I felt my skin crawl. I explained all this to the researchers who employed me, but they just laughed it off. "You can't be scared of something that you're imagining," one told me. My double stood beside him and nodded his head, then smirked at me. I tried to take their words to heart, but over the next few days, I found myself growing more and more anxious around my tulpa, and it seemed that he was changing. He looked taller and more menacing. His eyes twinkled with mischief, and I saw malice in his constant smile. No job was worth losing my mind over, I decided. If he was out of control, I'd put him down. I was so used to him at that point that visualizing him was an automatic process, so I started trying my damnedest to not visualize him. It took a few days, but it started to work somewhat. I could get rid of him for hours at a time, but every time he came back, he seemed worse. His skin seemed ashen, his teeth more pointed. He hissed and gibbered and threatened and swore. The discordant music I'd been listening to for months seemed to accompany him everywhere. Even when I was at home, I'd relax and slip up, no longer concentrating on not seeing him, and there he'd be, and that howling noise with him. I was still visiting the research center and spending my 6 hours there. I needed the money, and I thought they weren't aware that I was now actively not visualizing my tulpa, but I was wrong. After my shift, one day, about 5.5 months in, 2 impressively men, it says impressively.
Strong men, big men, hot men.
2 impressively hot men grabbed and restrained me, and someone...
I'm going to assume it's strong.
I'm going to guess strong as well. And someone in a lab coat jabbed a hypodermic needle into me. I woke up from my stupor back in the room, strapped into the bed, music blaring, with my doppelganger standing over me cackling. He hardly looked human anymore. His features were twisted. His eyes were sunken in their sockets and filmed over like a corpse's. He was much taller than me, but he hunched over. His hands were twisted and the fingernails were like talons. He was, in short, fucking terrifying. I tried to will him away, but I just couldn't seem to concentrate. He giggled and tapped the IV in my arm. I thrashed my restraints as best I could, but could hardly move at all. They're pumping you full of the good shit, I think. How's the mind?
What the what?
All fuzzy? He leaned closer and closer as he spoke. I gagged. His breath smelled like spoiled meat. I tried to focus, but couldn't banish him. The next few weeks were terrible. Every so often, someone in a doctor's coat would come in and inject me with something, or force feed me a pill. They kept me dizzy and unfocused, and sometimes left me hallucinating or delusional. My thought form was still present, constantly mocking. He interacted with, or perhaps caused, my delusions. I hallucinated that my mother was there, scolding me, and then he cut her throat and her blood showered me. It was so real that I could taste it. The doctors never spoke to me. That's fucked up. I begged at times, screamed, hurled obscenities, and demanded answers. They never spoke to me. They may have talked to my Tulpa, my personal monster, I'm not sure. I was so doped and confused that it may have just been more delusion, but I remember them talking with him. I grew convinced that he was the real one and I was the thought form. He encouraged that line of thought at times and mocked me at others. Another thing that I pray was a delusion, he could touch me. More than that, he could hurt me. He'd poke and prod at me if he felt I wasn't paying enough attention to him. I know someone like that. Okay, this gets weird. Once he grabbed my testicles and squeezed until I told him I loved him.
What the? Who wrote this shit?
I know someone like that. Another time, he slashed my forearm with one of his talons. No. I still have a scar. Most days, I can convince myself that I injured myself and just hallucinated that he was responsible. Most days. Then one day, while he was telling me a story about how he was going to gut everyone I loved, starting with my sister, he paused. A strange look crossed his face, and he reached out and touched my head, like my mother used to do when I was feverish. He stayed still for a long moment, then smiled. All thoughts are creative, he told me. Then he walked out the door. 3 hours later, I was given an injection and passed out. I awoke unrestrained. Shaking, I made my way to the door and found it unlocked. I walked out into the empty hallway and then ran. I stumbled more than once, but I made it down the stairs and out into the lot behind the building. There, I collapsed, weeping like a child. I knew I had to keep moving, but I couldn't manage it. I got home eventually. I don't remember how. I locked the door and shoved a dresser against it, took a long shower, and slept for a day and a half.
I'm imagining the scene from Ace Ventura where he's in the shower and just sobbing.
Nobody came for me in the night, and nobody came the next day or the one after that. It was over. I'd spent a week locked in that room, but it had felt like a century. I'd withdrawn so much from my life beforehand that nobody had even known I was missing. The police didn't find anything. The research center was empty when they searched it. The paper trail fell apart. The names I'd given them were all aliases. Even the money I'd received was apparently untraceable.
What?
I recovered as much as one can. I don't leave the house much, and I have panic attacks when I do. I cry a lot. I don't sleep much, and my nightmares are terrible. It's over, I tell myself. I survived. I used the concentration those bastards taught me to convince myself. It works sometimes. But not today, though. 3 days ago, I got a phone call from my mother. There's been a tragedy. My sister's the latest victim in a spree of killings, the police say. The perpetrator mugs his victims, then guts them.
Fuck that.
The funeral was this afternoon. It was as lovely a service as a funeral can be, I suppose. I was a little distracted, though. All I could hear was music coming from somewhere distant. Discordant, unsettling stuff that sounds like feedback and shrieking and a modem dialing up. I hear it still, a little louder now.
So he's the one that's doing it.
I don't know if he's the one that's doing it, or they're like triggering him and it's happening, or he just hears it because this thing was there watching him at the funeral. Because he had already killed. So, like, it sounds like he's killed other things before his sister too.
Okay.
And it said he was going to start with his sister, so it sounds like the string of killings was like practicing. And then he got to the sister, but either way, this one's kind of crazy, written by Anonymous, and pretty fucked up.
Anonymous.
But I enjoyed it. So thank you to Anonymous for writing it. Pretty good stuff to start the show. Hopefully, good stuff in the way that murder can be good, because it's interesting when it's short fiction. So, yeah.
All right, so the first story I'm going to read tonight is called The Wrong Room. It's a real short one. So strap on, strap in. It's going to be quick and fast, and we don't want you going out the window when we break. Right. So.
That was interesting. I liked it.
You liked it?
Yeah.
Thank you. It goes. You get back into your apartment after a long day's work and you want to get inside and rest. You are about to pull out your keys and unlock the door, but you notice it's open. Turning the doorknob and stepping inside, you notice something different. You stand in the doorway trying to figure it out. Then it hit you. This isn't your room. As you turn and leave, something catches your eye. There's a man hunched over a dish of flesh, eating it with his bare hands, tearing into it as a wild animal would with its prey. Red dripped down the side of his mouth, and the smell that emanated from it was sickening. You were paralyzed by the sight.
Just gonna point out, it's his fucking room. Like, you shouldn't be judging him so harshly. You're the intruder here.
Unconsciously, you start to cover your nose and mouth. This accidentally bumps your elbow against the doorway. You freeze. He stopped eating. There was something wrong. Then he looks up and started searching for the source of the noise. His eyes scanned the room until they found you. Your legs start moving on their own and you find yourself running away from that room and the horrors within it. The man silently stands up, locks the door, sits back down, grabs another slice of pizza, and mutters quietly to himself, "Crazy vegans."
That was funny. See, it's like two different perspectives. He seems like a monster, but he's really just eating pizza. Not a piece of a human being, which is what they definitely made it sound like.
Yeah, it's really freaking good. I liked it. Credit to Walrus King for writing that quick and dirty sturdy.
Quick and dirty sturdy. We appreciate it. So before we move into our next story, we are going to take a really quick commercial break. And we're back.
Welcome back. It's the other side of the episode. This next story is titled "The Last Body I Ever Cut Open." So, prep your butts for that.
I hope they're a doctor. Otherwise, it's going to get weird.
We'll find out. All right. Craig Brockwell was found by his wife, dead on their living room floor, a plastic garbage bag tied off around his neck and an empty bottle of Xanax on the kitchen counter next to a suicide note. My initial external examination of the body revealed no indications of a physical altercation with another person. Skin deep, the evidence was consistent with suicide by pills and suffocation. I was prepared to judge it such when Detective David Franklin requested an autopsy. "It just doesn't sit right with me," said
I like
David.
your detective voice.
Thanks.
It's so awesome.
Oh, thank you. I mean, this guy, he had it all. Pulling in millions, kid's a superstar on the ball court, wife's a knockout. And then he goes and offs himself. I frowned. "Depression can befall anyone, David," I said, "and people can be quite adept at concealing it." Oh God, I switched his voice. The main character's name is Jim. All right, we're going to change it from here. "Sure, Jim, sure. I get that. I guess that's not even what I'm talking about. It's just you weren't there at the scene. There was just..." David looked around the room, though there was nobody else there. Something felt off. That's all. "What do you mean, off? Is there some other evidence that I'm not aware of?" David sighed. "Look, let's just say you do this one for me. I'll owe you. Take you out for beers later for a start." I looked down at Mr. Brockwell's corpse. Autopsies were invasive and expensive, and generally I avoided them unless there was a good reason to perform one. That was up to my discretion, but I supposed that a detective's intuition was a good enough reason. It's not like David made a habit of requesting autopsies. "Okay," I said. "I'll do the autopsy, but David, I don't drink." At the time, it was true that I didn't drink.
Oh, shit. Your voice for the detective reminds me of Tommy Boy when he's trying to sell the brake pads and he's still bad at it. And he, has the car collision because the brake pads don't work.
What the fuck?
And he's like, "Ambulance, here comes the meat wagon." And he's like, the guy gets out, takes a cigar out of his mouth, is like, "Oh my God." That's what I picture. Detective.
You're so stupid. Okay.
New guy's in the corner puking his guts out. Blah. All because you want to save a couple extra bucks on brake pads.
You're so goddamn.
The movie's so fucking good. It's on Netflix. Go check out Tommy Boy if you've never seen it and do yourself a favor. Chris Farley is a master of comedy. R.I.P.
I made an incision along the body's chest and set down my scalpel. A look at the lungs would tell me whether or not suffocation had indeed been the cause of death.
Do you know what that definition is? Suffocation.
No breathing. You should have. I was talking to Liz earlier.
Of course.
And it was something else where it was, what is it called when you cut off someone's head?
Decapitation.
Yeah. So we were talking about something. Decapitation came up, and I was just like, decapitation. No breathing.
I guess you're right.
Anyway, I don't know why. I began to peel back the skin and muscle. As I did, I looked in shock to see that there was nothing there. When I say that there was nothing there, I mean that it was totally black, like peering into a completely dark space devoid of light. There should have been a ribcage there. There wasn't. There was nothing. I dropped the flaps of skin that I was holding and stood up. I shook my head. No, I thought, that's ridiculous. I knew that I had a headlamp around somewhere, so I went looking for it. I pulled open a drawer, and that's when everything became silent. We grow accustomed to them, but we're surrounded constantly by sounds. The slight buzz of the electric lights above us, the hum of the boiler in the basement, the sound of our own breath, the rustle of our clothes as we move.
The cars passing by constantly behind the office of recording.
The sound of a drawer opening. None of it was there. It was as though I had gone completely deaf. I don't know why exactly, but I had a sudden urge to look at the body on my examination table. I turned my head, but it turned far slower than I intended, as though I were losing control of my body. Or time had slowed down, or the room had become thick with some invisible substance. The dead and naked body was just as I had left it, of course, with the incision along its chest and the skin there curled back slightly from where I'd begun to peel it. All at once, a rush of sound returned to my ears and my movements resumed their typical speed. I shook my head once again and turned back to the drawer. I found the headlamp, strapped it onto my head, and went back to the body. I flipped on the light, opened the skin up again, and gazed into utter darkness. There was nothing there. The darkness consumed the light from the headlamp. It seemed endless. I steadied myself and tore the skin back further. Instead of the rib cage and bits of tissue, there was only the nothingness.
Drop a quarter in. Wait till you hear it go kerblunk.
That's not what quarters sound like.
If they hit liquid.
They sound like chink, right?
If they hit rock or stone, or rock is stone. He should go and get a fucking road flare and just chuck it into the sky.
I tentatively stuck a finger into it. As soon as I did, the silence returned and everything slowed down again. My finger felt incredibly cold, like touching dry ice. I withdrew it as quickly as I could, which was not very quickly at all. It was like coming out of quicksand, but once I was out, the expected pace of reality fell back into place. I have a feeling it's going to be something about the suicide note that he left. There's got to be something in there about what's going on here.
Swallowed a black hole. Can't do this anymore.
I jumped back and picked up my scalpel. I made a deep slice along the right thigh and pulled up the skin. More nothingness. I repeated the procedure on the left thigh to the same result. My hands were shaking and my mind was in blank shock. My mind was as empty as the body in front of me. Nothing could explain this. I walked around to the head and made a cut around the circumference of the crown, which is your skull. I peeled the flesh away and there was nothing. As I stared into it, I froze. I stood holding the severed scalp, staring into the nothingness, unable to do anything else. I don't know how long I was in that state, but the sound of David's voice snapped me out of it sometime later. God, okay. Let me prep for David here. How's it going on down there, Jim? I dropped the piece of dead flesh and hair that I had been holding and turned to look at David. This is very bizarre. I've never seen anything like this. I can't explain it. And how's that? Asked David. I pointed to the body. Just look, I said. So David walks across the room and peers into the darkness. What the fuck? He whispered.
I sincerely thought it was going to be like normal when he looked, but I'm glad it hasn't happened.
I don't know, I said. I don't know. David started reaching inside the head.
No.
I wouldn't do that, I cautioned. He ignored me and kept reaching. Then his hand was inside the head. He froze suddenly, except for his eyelids, which opened wide in shock. David, pull your hand out, now. David's eyes got even wider. He was trying to say something, but his lips wouldn't open. It came out muffled, but I had no doubt what he was trying to say. Help. All at once, David jerked forward 2 feet so that he was now into the body, up past his elbow. The look on his face grew even more frantic and desperate. I grabbed onto his other arm and yanked, but it was no good. The body was stronger and was pulling him in, now up to the bicep. I watched in pure horror as the head seemed to expand in size as if it were growing larger so that it would suck in all of David. Instinct took over and I ran to my tray of tools. I grabbed my bone saw and switched it on as I made my way back to David. Oh no, I know what's going to happen. Oh God.
Gore warning.
Yep, gore trigger warning here. I applied the saw to his shoulder, which was now mere inches away from the terrible maw of nothingness. I drove the saw in furiously, blood splattering on my face, the muffled would-be screams of David trying to assert themselves over the whir of the saw. At last, I cut through the bone and David fell back on me, so that I hit the ground with him on top of me, and I could see the last of his severed arm disappear into the nothingness. Now that his lips would open again, David was wailing in agony. I rolled out from under him and went to work on cauterizing the wound, praying that he wouldn't die. I paused long enough to dial 911 and explain the need for help over the speakerphone function as I performed the surgery. That's so fucked up, okay? I sat by the hospital bed until David regained consciousness. He looked at me with terrified eyes and grabbed my wrist with his remaining hand, his fingernails digging into me. I saw it, David said. I still see it. Nothing. That is what I am, and what you are, everything, is nothing. I broke free of his grip. That's absurd, I said. I don't know how to explain that body, but I know that I am not nothing.
You just had to cut the guy's arm off, like humor him a little bit.
David started laughing then. I left him at the hospital, went home, and had my first drink in 2 years. I knew that it was a horrible mistake, but I did it anyway, to wash away the horror. When I was drunk enough, I resolved to return to the morgue, determined to burn Craig Brockwell's body. I got in my car, like a monster, and drove, weaving across the road. When I arrived, I flung the door open, my mind and body overtaken by the alcohol. I looked into the room, and even through my drunken haze, it registered that something was very, very wrong. The body was gone. Craig Brockwell's attempted autopsy happened 10 years ago. For a year afterwards, I drank. I lost my job, refusing to return back to work. I burned through my savings, and by the end of the year, I had hit rock bottom, as it's called. That was shortly after Detective David Franklin committed suicide. Now, I have my life back together. I still have nightmares, but I have, for the most part, put the incident behind me. I have a loving family and a new career. I cannot express how grateful I am for this new life, but yesterday, I saw something. I left my office at 5 p.m., as usual, and walked across the parking lot to my car. I got in, started it up, and checked my rearview mirror. Standing there was a man. It was unmistakably David Franklin. I turned my head and looked out the back window. He was still there. He opened his mouth, and there inside was endless darkness. The world grew silent, and I watched, unable to move, as he lifted his only arm and pointed a finger at me. Then he turned and walked away. End of story.
Pretty fucked up.
Pretty fucked up. Credit to Nathaniel Lewis. Thank you for writing such a fucked up and amazing story. I really enjoyed it. It is totally up my alley.
Because it's so fucked up.
Because it's so fucked up. It's a good one. I like it. If they turned it into a movie, I would watch it. Or like a Twilight Zone episode or something.
It's almost like the emptiness, the nothingness is infectious. Obviously because at this point David has it, but why in the hell would you put your hand into someone's empty head? You know what I mean?
Curiosity killed the
throw
cat.
stuff in there first. Quarters, road flares, who the fuck knows? Like a 2x4. See if there's a capacity within this body before you start reaching your hand into it, David. Good Lord.
Now all I can think of is Clifford Franklin.
Wow. I guess. But all right, I'm going to go ahead and move into my last and the last story of the show, and this one's called The Houseboat. And it's going like this, and it's short, just FYI. In a private terminal at the Port of Boston, there is a houseboat. This houseboat has been anchored there permanently for at least 50 years.
What?
The eccentric owner has maintained all fees and taxes and is in good standing with the Port Authority. Still, even if the owner wasn't financially responsible, no one would ask them to depart. Despite the owner's friendly, hospitable, if odd nature, there is a persistent air of unease around the boat and the area of the port surrounding. Very few people have taken the owner up on offers of hospitality, but those who do recount a wholly unbelievable tale. When you step into the houseboat, it's as if you are sent back 50 years in time.
What?
Looking out windows depicts a cityscape of antiquity, and the television receives live broadcasts of programs of the era, including news programs.
That's cool.
If you look out the open door, you see the city as it stands today. When the door closes, you can see the 50-year-old skyline through the port opening. Some visitors who spend time with the owner notice something particularly disturbing, an almost uncanny resemblance to their host despite obvious age differences. Though this is odd, the owner is friendly and trustworthy, ignoring the air of unease most feel, so it isn't surprising if casual friendships build between a guest and the proprietor. All of this would, of course, be very strange and worthy of note, but dismissed as some form of elaborate hoax or illusion if it weren't for one additional detail. Whenever someone elects to spend the night in this houseboat after an evening of conversation and a few drinks, they are never heard from again. When the guest awakens in the morning, the owner is nowhere to be found, and suddenly, the city skyline never changes back to its contemporary appearance when exiting the boat. Under the bed, there is a briefcase full of $100 bills with a letter stapled to a list. The letter simply reads, "You have 50 years to follow these instructions if you wish to free yourself from this hell. The clock is ticking. Get to work."
That is horrifying. It's like, what is it?
11/22/63?
Yeah, something like that.
Except he could actually go back whenever the fuck he wanted.
Yeah.
In this case, you are just stuck there. But I do like the idea of time loops, so that one really appealed to me. And I feel like the reason people decide to stay there is because they're told the truth of what it is. And there's like something that they're promised, like riches, or just the knowledge of traveling back 50 years in the past where you can pull the old Biff Tannen and bet on all the sporting events.
What's 50 years back from now?
1971.
Right before World War, or not
Nope,
World War,
way
Vietnam
after.
War.
Nope.
Vietnam War is 1973.
It's about to come to an end.
Oh, is when in 1973 is when it ends.
Correct.
Okay, yeah, no, I wouldn't want to. Would I want to be born into that time? I feel like I would be.
It's different between being born into that time
being
and
sent
being
back.
sent back to that time.
Okay, if I'm my age now, sent back to the 1970s, I would not like it. Not my bag, baby.
Yeah, especially for you, because all the dudes had sideburns on their wieners. It was just that era.
Did they?
It's a joke from the movie Bulletproof with Adam Sandler and Damon Wayans. He goes, I can tell this is 70s porno. The guy's dick has sideburns.
Ew.
No, it's a joke. Obviously, it's a joke.
But it's just like I don't know. I'm spoiled. I live in the 21st century.
Send me back, man, because I know most of the sporting events now they're going to turn out, and I will bet on all that shit.
I will bet on the 85 Bears. That's the only one I know.
Okay, cool. I know a lot. So it just depends on what that list states. I wonder what is on that list. Hopefully it's nothing too terrible. Hopefully it's just like accomplish these ridiculous tasks like go to the moon, which would be
go to
difficult.
the moon.
Like stand atop the Eiffel Tower and kiss the most beautiful woman in the world or some crazy shit like that. But you have 50 years to do it, so who knows? It's a good one. It's thought-provoking, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I want to thank everyone who watched this live. You all are just amazing. You make these episodes so much fun to record. And if you've never joined us for a live show, we do it at twitch.tv/scarishpodcast and youtube.com/scarish every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. That is Pacific time.
If anybody wants to give me some voice actor work, feel free to hit me up. I'm down.
Hit us up. We'd love to do it. I have an isolation chamber I can bust out. It'll be a fun time. On top of that, if you would like to reach out to us to either recommend a creepypasta, send us your own, or send us a true story that has happened to you, we would love to hear from you. You can email storytime@scarish.com for the true stories. For creepypasta-related things, you can email pastatime@scarish.com, or go to our website, scarish.com. Click on Contact Us, fill out that form. It does come directly to us, or hit us up on our social medias. Facebook.com/scarishpodcast is our Facebook page, and you can also watch the live shows there. And you can also hit us up on Twitter, which is @ScarishPod, or Instagram, which is @ScarishPodcast. Either way, we would love to hear from you. Robin, for folks who would like to donate to us, how can they do so?
You can go to patreon.com/scaryishpodcast. Those are monthly donations. Tiers start at $1. At $1, you get ad-free episodes, which you can't go wrong with ad-free.
Ad-free is the way to be.
You can also go over to Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/scarishpodcast, and those are one-time donations if you're not into the whole monthly donation type thing. And yeah.
Indeed. Shout out to all the spooky friends we watch. Shout out to Pink Penguin. You're pretty awesome. Don't ever doubt that. And that's everything that we have for this episode. So go ahead and sign us out.
Keep on creeping on. We'll talk to you guys later.
Bye.
I want to shove this in your mouth so bad.
Bye.